The month of June started with a $160 million download celebration. We got some new login bonus rewards, as well as a new weekend strengthening event, where you could farm the Awakening medals for every typing, and a brand new Neo Gods leader. Physical Super Sentry Gotenks was the super physical Neo Gods leader. A team that was decent, but the problem was that most physical type Dokkan Fests were extreme, so the only top tier card you had on that team was Physical Vegito Blue. Thankfully, Gotenks was phenomenal, so he pretty much carried that team by himself. This guy had the same super attack mechanic as his tech counterpart, so 3 different super attacks, and if you didn't know, they showed this guy's details a day before he came out, and the outrage was so bad that they actually buffed him. Before the changes, this guy's 12 key super would sacrifice 7% of your HP, which was horrible since the guy was already a glass cannon. He loses 30% defense for 7 turns to gain a 60% attack buff, but before the changes, that buff was actually a 30% attack buff, so you can already see why people were pissed. But yeah, after the buffs, that guy was very good. He massively raised attack on his 11 key super while doing immense damage to the enemy, while also having a massive 180% attack buff for his first 7 turns. That meant that this guy was just the hardest hitting TOR in the game. I think this was the first TOR to be able to launch 2 million attack stats quite consistently. Well, that's if you managed to hit his 11 key super, which wasn't an easy thing to do since that guy had 2 very powerful key links that he shared with Physical Vegito Blue, so you didn't want to link them together. But he had the perfect linking body, Physical Super Saiyan Gotenks. That guy shared 4 links with Super Sentry Gotenks, with only one of them being a key link, so it made it way easier to hit that 11 key next to him. And Super Saiyan Gotenks also sealed, something that was very helpful since Super Sentry Gotenks couldn't tank due to his 30% defense debuff. Anyways, as you'll see later on, that guy only got better with time due to him getting more teams. This guy also came with a bunch of new awakenings. AGL Super Saiyan Gotenks was unfortunately the worst Super Saiyan Gotenks in the game. He was a nuker gaining 15% attack per key spheres obtained, while lowering defense on super, but that was it. He had a 12 key multiplier of 125%, which is very bad, especially for a unit that is essentially just doing damage. And he also lost shock and speed upon Dokkan Awakening, meaning that he just had the same links as the other Super Saiyan Gotenkses, so there was really no reason to bring him over the strength or physical one, who could both stun or seal on super, abilities that were so much more valuable than just straight up damage. He was still like an alright option though on a mono AGL team, but that was it. As soon as categories came into the game, it was just over for this guy. It's really unfortunate that they didn't keep him in base as a TUR. He could have at least been a good linking partner for the other Gotenkses. Tech Teen Super Sentry Gotenks on the other hand was very good. He raised his attack by 50% on super for 6 turns and had a pretty big 100% attack buff on super. But just like AGL Gotenks, they shafted his 12 key multiplier. He had a 12 key multiplier of 130%, something that held back his damage quite significantly. He still did a lot of damage, don't get me wrong, but just way less than if he had a better 12 key multiplier, something that didn't make global players feel any better, because yes, heroes cards at the time couldn't come to global due to licensing issues, so missing out on such a cool character did piss off quite a lot of global players, understandably. In Super Saiyan Goku almost got nothing open Dokkan Awakening, like all he got was a 20% attack buff and the Shattering the Limit key link, but he was an orb changer, so still usable in some niche scenarios, and obviously since he still had value due to that. Strength Gotenks was decent. He had a supreme damage multiplier, raised allies attack by 20% for 1 turn, and had a 77% start turn attack buff, as well as an additional 23% attack buff in the first slot, a buff that was unfortunately not calculated separately, so it was only a 100% attack buff in the first slot, which was still very good, but the problem with that guy is that he didn't have the prepared for battle key link, and Strength Super Saiyan Goku's team was kind of built around that key link, since it was the second most shared key link alongside Strength type GT units. But he did get a good spot on Super Saiyan 4 Gogeta's team once he came out, but we'll talk about that later on. As for Gotenks' banner, it was probably one of the weakest Neo Gods banner to date. It only had 2 other Dokkan Fests, being Physical Vegito Blue and Tech Super Sentry Gotenks, 2 units who were still very good, but that was it. If you were playing for some time, you probably already had all the other Gotenks with dupes. 5 days later, they re-released the Dragon Ball Heroes banner on JP. Like, obviously they weren't going to awaken an old Heroes character without giving people a way to pull him. At the same time, they also brought back the trophy card Adult Gotenks as login rewards. So you're telling me that this guy was given out on JP twice so far, but never even came to global once? That's just brutal, bro. And like, the Hero Celebration is pretty much over. Like, we're having the last one this month. So, wow, that's just, we're actually never going to get that card, like, ever. That's crazy. Nonetheless, a week later, and it was already time for the $170 million celebration. And it came with a new login bonus campaign, a new Bio Broly story event, a new banner, some new awakenings, and the friend summon Hercule could now be awakened into an LR. Let's start with the new story event. It came with 2 new free-to-play units. SR Physical Krillin was actually decent for an SR. He raised Allies attack by 20% for 1 turn on Super, and gained 3 ki and 3000 attack when below 80% HP. But he was an SR, so pretty much useless outside of strike events or any other event that required you to have a low team cost. It also didn't help that his rates were absolutely horrendous. Tech Broly was awful on release. He either had 1% defense when facing one enemy or 100% attack when facing multiple enemies, while also debuffing the other stat by 50%. So yeah, not great, especially in a time where we were not only facing one enemy most of the time, but defense was also not as useful. Luckily, he did get some use as time went on. He was one of like the only viable free-to-play option for AGL's percent Goku's easy. As for the other awakenings that came with this event, AGL's percent Goten was quite decent on a mono AGL team. He raised his attack by 50% for 3 turns on Super and had an unconditional 90% start of turn attack buff, so an all-around decent card. Physical's percent Kid Trunks had a similar kit. It's just that his attack buff wasn't at the start of turn, it was on Super. It was also 10% higher, so this guy was seen as better than Goten, since super attacks were not an impossible thing to achieve anymore. You were super in most of the times with your characters now, so this guy just had a higher attack buff 99% of the time. The new banner featured them both, including 3 new units. Tech's percent Kid Trunks was actually quite decent. He raised Allies attack by 20% on Super for 1 turn, had an 80% attack buff at the start of turn, and had 40% damage reduction when his guard was activated. That made him like a staple against any AGL enemies, and an SBR beast as you'll see later on. In's percent Goten had the same super attack effect and start of turn attack buff, but instead of gaining damage reduction whenever his guard was active, he had a 50% chance of reducing the damage he received by 40%. So he was a little bit more versatile than Trunks, but less consistent. And you already know how frustrating using a unit that has a 50% chance to guard is. So yeah, that guy was definitely worse than his Trunks counterpart. Strength Android 18 was quite good. She raised her attack by 50% on Super for 6 turns, had a 50% start of turn attack buff, and an additional 50% attack and defense when above 50% HP. The only problem is that most of her links were key links, and most of those links were links that she shared with extreme type units, but she was super, so she didn't quite fit on Strength percent for Goku's team. She was still very good though. Now, was the banner worth your stone? Probably not. Like sure, it had your 3 times 30 stones guaranteed featured unit discount, but that just wasn't enough to justify summoning on a non-Dokkan Fest banner or LR banner. Talking about LRs, LR Hercule was a decent free-to-play LR. He had a 20% chance of stunning the attacked enemy for 2 turns on his 12 key super, which was very good, and he gained 50% defense for 3 turns on his 18 key super, which was insane since that guy had LR stats. So that 50% defense above was actually very significant. He also had a 70% chance of gaining 20,000 attack and 7 ki at the start of turn. The ki was very useful, and it was quite a consistent thing to see, so not a bad passive at all. The problem is that this guy's links sucked, but not only that. To obtain him, you need to buy his medals from the Baba shop. Each medal costed 1 million Zenny, and you needed 140 of them to awaken him into an LR, with all of his potential paths unlocked. So if you do the math, that's 140 million Zenny, which was like 50 million more than what you needed to awaken LR Strength Broly. And the thing with this guy is that you couldn't miss a day, since you were only able to buy at most 3 medals per day. So it's either you had the Zenny that day, or you had to wait a day more to awaken him. He also had like horrendous drop rate in the friend summon banner, so that also didn't help. 2 days later, we had the 3rd volume of the Book of War, with a completely different pool of characters this time around. Just a reminder that those packs were about 35 bucks if you factor in inflation, so not a great deal if you ask me. Like imagine paying 35 bucks for 50 stones and int Android 13, like bro. 5 days later, and the official Dokkan Twitter account now had 200,000 followers. So to celebrate that milestone, they held a little Twitter campaign where they would give out a bunch of rewards depending on the amount of retweets that the designated tweet got. The rewards were actually pretty decent, as you can see. Like 20 stones and 3 Elder Kais is something that would still be seen as good even by today's standard. The final retweet milestone also gave the New Year Frieza, which by that point was not even a New Year unit, it was just like a Twitter unit, bro. At the same time, we also got a new double race banner. It came with 2 new awakenings and a new unfeatured LR Tech Rosé and Zamasu. So I guess the legendary summon banner for Volley was like a one-time thing. I guess it was because of the fact that he was a global first and all global LRs were featured on legendary summon banners. That's probably why. They didn't want GB players to complain. Nonetheless, just like the other LRs, these guys were phenomenal. Their leader skill was just like the other LRs, pretty good. And since the Extreme Tech Neo Gods leader wasn't out yet, this was the most optimal leader skill for an Extreme Tech team. They raised their defense by 30% for 3 turns on their 12th key and 6 turns on their 18th key. A very powerful ability on LRs since their base stats were very high. They also recovered 15% HP at the start of turn, which was very good on longer events. This ability alone turned the boss rush event into a complete joke, as you'll see later on. They also gained 30% attack per attack received, up to 120% attack. Like a 120% attack buff on an LR was nothing to laugh at. But what really made these guys shine was their link set. Unlike the other extreme type LRs, these guys had a very good link set, sharing at least 5 links with all of the other Zamasus or Goku Black unit in the game at the time. And if you were a Giga well, their TUR was also pretty decent. Like it had a different name and shared 6 links with the LR. Like bro, just imagine recovering 25% HP at the start of turn and having 2 units that could tank pretty well while doing an insane amount of damage after a couple of hits. Like this was probably one of the strongest rotation in the game. As a matter of fact, that rotation was so strong that people who were lucky enough to pull a dupe were wondering whether it was worth to keep a copy as a TUR or just unlock the bottom path for the LR. Which is crazy when you think about it. The other cool thing about them is that unlike the other LRs, these guys were very easy to awaken. No crazy Zen restriction, no battlefield medals or medals with horrendous drop rates. You just needed a couple of Dokkan events medals and that was it. Very easy. As for the other awakenings, Tech Bardock was actually decent. He greatly raised his attack on super and had a 100% attack buff when above 30% HP. And he could also now turn into a giant ape up to 2 times instead of only once. They didn't buff his giant ape transformation though, as I guess they were still pretty strong. Like not taking damage for a couple of turns was still an insane ability, and now he could do it twice. So yeah, that guy was good. Strength Fasha was also quite decent. She now raised Alai's attack by 20% for 1 turn on super, has 30% attack and defense at the start of turn, and can now, just like Bardock, turn into a giant ape twice. And since she had the Sane Roar link, probably the best offensive link at the time, she was actually a not so bad option of Strength Super Saiyan for Goku's team. So if you had Great Ape GT Super Saiyan 3 Goku, you could have 2 giant ape units in the same monotype team, turning the boss rush event into a complete breeze, obviously with a little bit of RNG. The next day, we had a notice in the news saying that the training tab was about to be updated. You would now be able to use multiple training items at the same time. They actually even uploaded a video on Twitter showcasing the new training UI, which I guess is exactly what we have now. So actually just let me show you a little clip of what the training UI used to be.
The new Goku I Dokkan Awakened. So, let's see what that does. Bam! You just max them out that fast. Pretty cool, actually. That is pretty good.
2 days later, we got another World Tournament. No new awakenings this time, just 1 new unit but a good one. Strength Teen Super Saiyan Gohan was not as phenomenal on release as he was as a TUR, but he was still very good. He had a 20% chance of stunning the attacked enemy for 2 turns on super and gave super class allies 2 key and 25% attack and defense. Like sure, his link set wasn't the greatest, but it wasn't the worst either, and the support kind of made up for it, so that guy was a solid unit. A couple of days later came the update 3.5.0, the update that renewed the training system. With it came a training campaign. It had your typical login bonus campaign where you could get a bunch of training items, awakening medals, and friend points by logging in every day. They increased the team cost limit you would get by leveling up. I actually didn't know that, but before that update, the maximum team cost you could have at rank 50 was 100, so they bumped it to 135, I guess to help out new players. They also increased increased the amount of potential orbs you could obtain from the potential orbs events, and added some missions where you could obtain even more potential orbs. Nonetheless, the next day, they teased the next Dokkan Fest, and it looked like it was going to be a new Broly. The following day, it was already time for the $180 million celebration. It brought some new daily missions, a new login bonus campaign, the 4th volume of the Book of War, and the new Dokkan Fest, who was none other than Super Saiyan 3 Broly. Tech Super Saiyan 3 Broly was the Extreme Tech Neo Gods leader, a team that had a lot of potential, especially with the release of LR Tech, Zamasu, and Rosé. But unfortunately, that Broly just had to be the worst Neo Gods leader. But let's just pause for a minute. Just imagine the hype that this guy generated at the time. Like, imagine logging in one day and just seeing a new Super Saiyan 3 Broly Dokkan Fest. Like Super Saiyan 3 Broly. Then looking at his kit and just being so disappointed. But like trying so hard to justify him being not that bad. Because it's Super Saiyan 3 Broly. You don't want him to suck. But they just had to shaft him. He was a nuker with an immense damage multiplier, greatly lowering the enemy's defense on Super, had a 100% attack buff at the start of turn, and an additional 12% attack per key spheres obtained. Like, on paper, that's pretty insane, but then you see that he also lowers his defense by 10% per key spheres obtained. And the thing is, that guy already had no defense, and a very low base stat defense, at least at 55%. So him lowering his defense even further was just so bad. Like, that guy couldn't even tank normal attacks, let alone a super, which would have probably been fine if he did like an insane amount of damage. Like, okay, sure, that guy did damage, a ton of damage, probably the hardest hitting TR at his peak, but it wasn't consistent. You needed key spheres to do so, so most of the times he was just hitting as hard as the other Neo Gods leaders, but with pretty much negative defense. His link set also didn't help. They didn't give him over in a flash, so he could, I guess, link up better with the other Brolys, but there was no other Broly on his monotech team, so he literally had no good linking partners, like none on his own team. Like, bro, his best linking partner that wasn't a Broly and on his team was Tech Angel Super Saiyan 3 Goku, a unit that had over in a flash. So yeah, why not just give him over in a flash? Like, that guy was just poorly designed. But he did make somewhat of a comeback on Super Saiyan 3 Bardock's team, but we'll talk about that later on. Broly also came with 3 new Great Ape Awakenings. AGL Vegeta was not great. Sure, he had a supreme damage multiplier and could transform into a giant ape twice, but that HP restriction just sucked, honestly. And that link set was so bad. Like, his best linking partner that was also AGL was the UR Great Ape Turles, but I guess his awakening only required 3 Nappa medals from the Saiyan Warrior Story event, so for how easy he was to awaken, I guess he wasn't that bad. Strength Raditz was actually way better. He, just like Vegeta, could now transform into a giant ape twice, but he had a Nuken passive, gaining 12% attack and defense per key spheres obtained. Actually the exact same passive as Tech Perfect Cell, and he actually linked pretty well with Strength Fasha, another giant ape unit that could also create key spheres. So unlike Vegeta, that guy at least had a decent partner, even though his link set also wasn't the greatest. Physical Kid Goku was also okay, like he had an unconditional 80% start of turn attack buff and could now transform into a giant ape unit twice, but he also suffered from a bad link set, so he didn't fit quite well on the other monotype teams. His link set was probably even worse than the other ones at the time. So if you were wondering if that 4th volume of the Book of War was worth it, well, clearly it wasn't. Unless you were like a big fan of the giant ape units. Broly's Dokkan event also brought a new Dokkan Awakening for the free-to-play physical Broly that you could farm from the previous Broly Dokkan event. Physical Super Saiyan 3 Broly was actually a very good free-to-play unit. He had a supreme damage multiplier and 3 key and a 70% attack buff at the start of turn. A very decent passive at the time. The only problem with that guy was his link set. Like, it sucked, bro. Formidable Enemy and Hardened Grudge were pretty much non-existent links, and Limit Breaking Form was a link exclusive to Super Saiyan 3 characters, but that's literally the only link he shared with other Super Saiyan 3 characters. So yeah, that guy just had a poorly designed link set, but he was free and had the Fierce Battle link, so I guess there was that. As for Super Saiyan 3 Broly's banner, it featured Masked Saiyan, who was still a very good unit, Tech Merge Zamasu, who just got better with the release of LR Zamasu and Rosé, Tech Golden Frieza, who was still a phenomenal tank, Tech Cell that was still a decent nuker, Tech Final Form Cooler, who was also still good, and Tech Buff Buu, who was okay, I guess. So yeah, decent banner. Nothing crazy, but decent. Honestly better than Super Saiyan 3 Gotenks banner if you ask me.